and Attorney General Josh Stein. I welcome you to tonight's conversation on victims of color. This is our second in a continuing series of learning sessions for the task force. You can see our schedule and keep up with us at ncdoj.gov/trek. We'll also put that in the chat for those that are with us on Zoom. As you may know, the task force issued a report in December 2020 with 125 recommendations that we believe will move us toward racial equity in the criminal justice system and a system that works better for everyone. We are now in implementation mode and working hard to accomplish our recommendations across the state. In the report, we speak in specific detail about the need to challenge the idea that criminal justice reform and racial equity in criminal justice are somehow in opposition to care for victims and survivors of crime. That is not only because we believe we can and must do both, but also categories of people who have been harmed and those who have done harm are overlapping. So we recommended change promote equity in the victim compensation process and in the establishment of restorative justice programs, but we also recommended that we do screening and treatment for victimization at incarceration. So with that little bit of background, I am very pleased to turn this conversation over to our moderator for this evening and Southern Culture reporter. She is also co-host of the public radio podcast Tested and host of the special podcast series Polly about the life of social justice activist, author, and attorney Polly Murray. Leonida's work of note includes a series of stories on race, slavery, memory, and monuments. She also worked with public television and independent lens on the hanging death of Lennon Lacy, an African-American teenager in Bladen County. Leonida's essay, Black Women Vote, was recently published in the book 45 for 45 by Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Ms. Enge, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jasmine. I am honored to be able to take part in this second in a series of learning. This one, where we will be able to talk freely about why it seems as if the criminal justice system is not maybe responsive enough to victims of color and what can be done about that. So tonight's panel includes Dolly and Tony Griggs, North Carolina residents and activists who have continued to fight for justice for their son, Christian, who was shot several times in the back and killed in 2013. We'll also have Zariel Belugan, a Raleigh racially harassed with a gun pulled on them by two white men wearing Make America Great Again hats. Was this a misdemeanor assault or ethnic intimidation? And hopefully that'll be something we'll discuss tonight. We also have Durham County District Attorney, Satana DeBerry. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions for you tonight. DA DeBerry, she was elected
every night. He took a life and went home. The forensic experts who reviewed the case files, private investigators, and 12 jurors in the civil trial by unanimous decision all came to the same conclusion. Pat Chisholm Hall did not kill my son in self-defense, and there's no way the shooting happened the way that he said it did. This should not be Christian's story.
When I listened to that, I know when that happened, and then you fast forward to today, what did you expect justice to look like, when that case started? I'm sure you were shocked by the road that it was starting to take. And then when you think about even today, because there've been, this is sadly not the only time we've probably heard a story similar to this. And so I just wonder, what would you tell people that you really, what did you want to happen? What did you want law enforcement, the steps to take, after this horrific incident happened? I'm sure the things that follow you didn't even expect. So what does justice look like? What would have justice looked like for you, from the beginning of this tale?
I think justice, the day that my son was murdered, like I said, my husband called me and we all went to the scene and we saw the EMS trying to revive my son. And so The deputies, they were all there. They had the crime scene taped off with yellow tape. And they came down and said that, we're taking your son to Wake Med. And one of the questions I said, is he alive? And he said, yes. And so we got in the vehicle and followed the ambulance there. While we were there praying for our son to survive, they were at the scene covering for this man that just murdered my son. When we were there, I never would have imagined that we would come back and face the injustice that we did for our son. That they closed the crime scene the same day that it happened, before they even got the autopsy. They allowed the family, the church members, before even the event happened about around 11 that morning, before it got dark, they let the family, the church member, come to clean up the crime scene until they got the autopsy results that Monday. Then they come back to try to do a search warrant. I just never, I guess I was naive to feel like that that we would get justice. I was naive until we started this process and realized that our son was not going to get justice, and what we had to fight against to.
Yeah, I would say my experience was really disappointing up to this point. Disappointment, you just can't express in words. I'm a veteran, retired Army. I fought for this nation. I fought for this Constitution. And all we looked for in justice was being treated fair and equal. And we've been treated everything other than by this justice system and these elected officials. You would think that with the gravity and the situation that they would have done the right thing, but they done everything in their power but the right thing. They intervened in our civil lawsuit as a third party to the guy that murdered my son. But yet they're the same ones I'm expected to go back to and ask them to bring criminal charges against this man. We had a civil jury, a jury trial with 12 of his peers who said that he murdered my son. He killed him not in self-defense, that the Castle Doctrine was not applicable. But yet this sheriff and this district attorney can't find it within themselves to bring charges. One of the things that the sheriff will tell you is it was not during his tenure. Well, there is no statute of limitations when it comes to murder. So his tenure is kind of irrelevant to that fact. And then another thing they'll tell you is the burden of proof in a criminal trial is beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, that's for a jury to decide. All the sheriff and the elected official, the DA, needs is probable cause. And after 5 days of testimony in court, having heard testimony and saw evidence, and a jury deliberated for 93 minutes and returned a unanimous verdict, they couldn't find probable cause to bring charges. Disappointment just doesn't do fit to how I feel.
So that's not what justice is in your eyes.
Surely not.
Because in your case, even to have any semblance of a trial, of any type of jury trial, you got that far and still things didn't move on our head like you think they should have. DA DeBerry, I'm sure you've heard of several cases, maybe not exactly like this one in your career. And no, I'm sure, I'm not saying these incidents like this happen in your county, in Durham County, but I know you've positioned yourself as a progressive prosecutor who has promised to make the criminal justice system, more equitable, more fair, especially for the disproportionate number of Black and Brown people who are behind bars and who are also victims. So, maybe you can just kind of tell us, how is your first term going, as a DA in North Carolina?
Yeah, first I'd like to extend my condolences to the Griggs. I think their situation is a real example of how the criminal legal system is not set up for victims. It is and it's especially not set up for victims of color. We recognize that communities of color are both over-policed and underprotected. You know, when you hear communities of color say they want more police, often what they mean is they want better policing, right? They want people to be able to tell the difference between somebody who's causing trouble in their community and their children. And so what we try to do in Durham really is focus on what we can provide for victims. We don't have a lot of resources. You hear a lot of prosecutors saying they do what they do for victims, but yet we don't have a system that provides us any resources really for victims. And what we have tried to do in our office over the last couple years is to victims don't make the decisions, right? The lawyers make the decisions. We have it's the discretion of the prosecutors whether we move forward with cases, but we also try to listen with victims, train our staff to be trauma informed, right? To understand that for many victims, it is very hard to talk about what happened to them, and that we don't set artificial deadlines on them to tell us what happened, that we provide as many services as we can, especially for those folks who have been the victims of tremendous violence. And that we do have a restorative piece to that as well. We know that a lot of victims say to us, you know, sure, it's fine if they go to jail, but that's really what I want to know is why me? Why did this person pick me? What is it that I can do to feel safe again? And so we try to take all of those things into account when we are prosecuting cases. And also remembering that for Black and Brown communities, our victims and defendants are often the same people, right? I continuously say the dirty little secret of the criminal justice system is that not only are all the defendants Black and Brown, but all the victims are too. And so we want to really be aware of that in the work that we do.
You know, Professor Bell, is anything you've heard surprising so far? Or does it sort of reinforce your findings and your work? So can you explain, I mean, I guess the concept that you've written about called legal estrangement, you know, which sort of signals to groups living on the margins, many of them Black people that, you know, maybe in the criminal justice system, they don't count. Maybe you can better define that for me, your work, but I'd like to know what you're thinking right now.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to express my condolences to the Griggs. And I want to just also say, you know, as someone who I'm from South Carolina, that wasn't part of my bio, but I admire the work that is happening in North Carolina, our kind of sister to the north, and hoping that this can be an example of work that can happen elsewhere. I mean, so you start off by asking whether anything I've heard is surprising, and no, it's not surprising. You know, I think one of the really sad truths of Blackness in America, but I think, you know, perhaps particularly in some places more than others, is that this history of being victimized, having, you know, real harms happen, and then the state, you know, the police and the criminal system really only be present to oppress and not to do justice is consistent. You know, so you know, we talk a lot about accountability and how we'd like to have people be accountable for the crimes they commit, the harms they create. But really, the criminal system, by and large, not in every place, not in every locality, not with every particular DA, but by and large, for historical reasons that I'll say a little bit more about to answer the question about legal estrangement. But those systems are perhaps systems of accountability. Well, basically, they're systems of punishment. They're not systems of accountability. I think that's really important. The way, especially when victims are Black or brown, and especially when the offender is white, we have a very long history of the criminal system not being a place that people are held accountable. And in fact, the Griggs story really very much syncs up with a very long history that, as we know, continues to the present about the impunity of harm against Black people. So what does this mean in terms of legal estrangement? So one of the things you hear a lot in these like police reform, criminal justice reform circles is how we need to build more trust between Black communities in particular and the police. And that word trust, the way we think about it is like, well, if people were just respectful, if they just said that they cared, if they tried to care, or if they prosecuted someone actually, then maybe trust would turn around. And that's a deeply ahistorical conception of what the problem is. So one of the things we talk about in sociology is this idea of collective memory. So it's this idea that basically the injustices that Black people have suffered at the hands of the police, and also with the tacit acceptance of the police, which is what we're hearing from the Griggs story, that history is shared. We might not know all the details of every story, but this is the narrative. And so it's deeper than dealing with the problem of trust, in an individual interaction. It is instead about having to work around that history and how to think, how do we strategically build a system that is a system of accountability and not merely punishment of marginalized groups? And also, understand that because of the history, the strategies have to be individualized, they have to be particular to communities, and they also have to, in some places, have the police and the criminal system not be out front because the history is so deeply baked in. I'll stop talking there for now, but that's a basic primer on some of my work and findings.
Dolly and Tony Griggs, this makes me think about sort of your road from parents to grieving parents to now almost activists, in your community. So maybe you can tell us more about your efforts to achieve justice for your son and to really demand accountability from the law enforcement officials in your community, I guess, and in the state.
Before we talk about that, there was one thing I wanted to share, just to let you know how the officials here, the Hardin County Sheriff Department, what they thought of us. The day that they came out to tell us that they was not going to charge Pat Chisholm Hall, first of all, the detective, he hadn't even seen the autopsy report because he told us wrong. And he told us that Pat Chisholm Hall, the man that murdered my son, he was an outstanding person in the community and he didn't deserve this. So he looked through us, didn't even see us as an individual or as a parent that had just lost a son, had no sympathy or anything for us. And to speak in that way, he could not even see us as being someone that had a loss.
So in that time, so you could have crumbled after being treated so bad, treated that way, or you could fight. And it seems like you're a couple and a family that's been fighting ever since.
Right. It's something that I had to pray for, that, you had two choices to make. You could wither up and die, or you choose to fight. I feel like with this incident that we live in a county that what they do is they try to oppress people, to wait them out. So they wanted us to go away. They felt like, over time, their story would be, nobody would be talking about it. But I was thankful that God gave us the resources to fight, to be able to do a civil trial, and WRL did right before we did the trial, they did a 5-day series on it. So there's plenty of evidence out there for the sheriff and the DA to have made the right decision based just off the the medical examiner report when she said that Christian was lying face down when he was shot in the back 4 times. So we got met with a lot of people. We got with the color change when we first start off. I think you've heard of the color change. And we met with Dr. Reverend Barber. We met with a lot of activists that have fought along with us and have tried to bring our son's story to light. So it makes, and I also feel like we're not the only, there's other people with stories just like ours. And we just have to come together and fight a system. Sometimes systems, as the Harnett County, feel like they're untouchable, that they're too big, that they're just because they are protected by North Carolina law, how it's written, that is up to the discretion of the DA and the sheriff, whether they want to bring charges. So they can keep a criminal enterprise based off of this law. And so therefore they can keep victims in their county and just wait it out, that we will go away. But I choose to continue to tell my story, my son's story. And I never will stop telling his story.
Yeah, we're definitely not going to go away. That's not going to happen. As my wife said, the power resides within the district attorney and the sheriff, and there is no statute of limitations on murder. And as I told DA Stewart in court, you won't always be DA. At some point in time, there'll be someone who will come in and wants to do the right thing. And that will happen. And I will fight to that day to see to that happens and hold those in that county headquarters accountable until then.
Well, I'm sure a lot of families can learn from you, and especially your resilience, because I know this couldn't be easy. Professor Bell, like when I think of, Black and brown people like myself, how we've always felt in some ways when I think of growing up that we were being kind of picked on by police and law enforcement anyway. It seemed like it was always sort of like police were maybe in their squad cars in the parking lot after our football games, always everywhere that a lot of us thought we were having fun, So it's like you never could, you always had to have a guard up, like wondering, what was going on. So does your research sort of show that, that I know I couldn't be imagining this, sometimes, we've heard, I know I've heard people of color say, boy, when you need law enforcement, you can't get them, but when you don't want them, they're there, they're on the spot, ready, in your face.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. My research supports that. So in particular, I did a study in Baltimore with young people ages 15 through 24, where we had conversations about, wasn't the purpose of the conversation wasn't just, criticize the police. It was to ask about, how they felt about safety in their communities. And that's really important because I'm going to, confirm what you just said, which is that over and over again, we heard stories in the process of this research, very much like that. Even, young people talking about, being on the playground and, they're just, as you described, having fun. And so one example, I tell this example in a paper that I published called Anti-Segregation Policing, where there's like a group of young men who are walking, they're just kind of like walking around, in particular, a white neighborhood. And they knew that this was kind of, maybe they would stand out, but there were young people in a rich white neighborhood outside of Baltimore that they just kind of came across, and they saw pools in the backyards and were like, wow, look at how these people are living. This man who his kind of fake name for the purposes of the study is Richard. Richard says, we were walking through the neighborhood. I'm interested in like maybe being a real estate person one day. And so they were just basically walking through the neighborhood in the summertime, dreaming big, like you should be able to do when you're a teenager. And, of course, as one might expect, someone called the police on these young Black men walking through their neighborhood. And a police officer showed up and questioned them. And unlike a lot of the high-profile incidents that we tend to talk about in spaces like this and that tend to motivate task forces like this, nothing happened, right? So the police officer questions them. She doesn't find anything, and they leave. But the legacy of that story for Richard and those boys was still there. They knew that the police being called on them was a signal that they don't belong places like that. And so this is very, very important for understanding how deep the fix is and how much we have to do to overcome. Because yes, we need accountability when episodes of violence happen by police. We need accountability when they happen by private actors that are kind of supported by police, thinking here, of course, about the Griggs' story. We also need accountability and change for those day-to-day structurally created interactions that signal to Black people, not just that the police don't like you and the criminal system doesn't care about you, but that you just don't belong here at all. That is what we have to undo in these spaces. So I'm going to stop talking there, but yeah.
Yeah, I brought that up because of an incident not too long ago in North Carolina where a woman was in her car with her child, and they had just finished shopping, and actually some white men came up. This was in Northeast Raleigh, came up to their car, wearing the "Make America Great Again" hats, and really kind of trying to show they don't even belong there. Wherever they were, whichever parking lot this was, they didn't belong there. And not only, it just got worse and worse. So bad words were spewed, and then a gun. It's pretty much like, what, I'm going to intimidate you to the end to get out of my way and get out of my neighborhood. And, DA DeBerry, so do you think, there is how much of a problem with this over enforcement, or this discriminatory enforcement of Black communities by police? And you mentioned, your dirty little secret quote, of how the criminal justice system, that not only are all the defendants Black and brown, but a lot of the victims are too. But what do you say about this over enforcement that sometimes that we have to deal with?
Yeah, I really want to lift up this idea because Black and brown people know how they are treated when they are accused of crime, right? So when they're victims, they expect that same level of treatment. They want to have their feelings centered. They want to have their story acknowledged. They want to have that person held accountable. And very often the system, the criminal legal system, just does not do that. We have 30,000 criminal cases filed in Durham County every year. Only 10% of those are violent, right? So that means the vast majority of them are things like driving while your license is revoked, right? Simple possession of marijuana, sitting on the park bench. Everybody knows Black mamas won't let you smoke weed in their house. So Black kids smoke weed in their car, right? They get pulled over. It doesn't matter if they're an honor student, they get dragged into the same that same web of the criminal legal system that puts them in jeopardy. Well, the same thing happens for Black and brown people when they're victims. And it's like Professor Bell said, we are trying, what I am trying to do as a reformer is create a system of accountability where we are focused on those people who have done serious and violent harm to people in their community, and not on just the everyday things that we do because we're human, And I think for us in our office, we think that will mean that we actually give better service to victims, that we actually have time to hear victim stories, that we actually, one of the things that we've instituted since I've been in office is we do quarterly, we have um, a meeting with the families of homicide victims, and we do that in conjunction with the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham, who runs a grief group and provides support for homicide families. Because often, victims tell us they don't know what is going on, right? A homicide case can be charged and you never hear about it. You won't hear about it for another year. And so we want to do things that are transparent, and so that even when victims don't agree with the decision, the Griggs brought up the discretion of the district attorney. It is, in North Carolina, district attorneys are constitutional officers. They get to decide when charges move forward in court in every case. And sometimes they make the decision not to do that. And we want victims to understand why we have made that decision, or why a case does not move forward, or why a case is stuck, why it's taken so long. That doesn't mean that victims are going to agree with what we do, but I think it at least helps them feel like they are being heard in the moment. And again, black and brown victims don't feel that way, right? They feel like they get harassed for doing nothing. And then when something's done to them, they get harassed again.
So maybe Mr. and Mrs. Griggs, what would you say to leaders who want to create better relations, I guess like DA DeBerry, between law enforcement and minority communities in North Carolina? And maybe Professor Bell could chime in as well. I'm going to take a look at some of our questions in chat as well. But what do we want? Because that's the purpose of actually this session, because there are people who want to improve relations and really make racial equity in the criminal justice system something that we don't have to continue to talk about, because we'd have it, right? So what would you like?
I just listening to, is it DA DeBerry?
DeBerry.
The things that she's saying, I think is great, that you focus on, a lot of things, you focus on the major things. But as far as the DA Power in North Carolina, to me, I feel like it's too much, especially for victims, like me and my husband and other victims in our county, or in the state, because we have no avenue. If you have someone that's corrupt, so you have a sheriff department and you have a sheriff and a DA, they're really tight. And like this one man that murdered our son, he knows his family. They know each other. They're friends. They're families. So how do a family like our family, how do we get justice for our son? How do we get our case out of Harnett County? When you have the Attorney General, he's the highest a lawyer in the state of North Carolina, and he still doesn't even have the power to come down and say, let's look at this case. We're telling you that the sheriff's department altered the crime scene. You know why? Because we were there and we saw at the civil trial, we saw the evidence that they did that. So all these things, and we still can't get anyone to look at our case because it has to be referred out from the DA or the sheriff. So what do a family, if you have a family like our family, how do we get justice in that case? So how do victims like our family, who's there for us to be able to reach out to and say, hey, look at this. I know they said Department of Justice. We found, when we had the last administration, everything was shut down. But with this administration, we have been able to reach out to the Department of Justice and have communication with them. But the standard is very high. So I I really think that you're doing great things in Durham, and I really like the things that you're saying, but that's not like in these rural counties here, like what my family's experiencing, what other families are experiencing that are my color, that are poor, that are brown, that are poor, that have these this kind of power, that you're stuck.
You know what, when I first moved to North Carolina, I can't believe it's been 20 years now, but one of my biggest shocks as a young journalist, you see, I'm just calling myself, yeah. As a young journalist, I said, how come a state the size of North Carolina, how could it possibly have 100 counties? Like what is going on here? I mean, and people were looking at me like that's how I was like, no, 100 counties. I mean, and Georgia has almost as many, I think, but that's, to me, I was like, this is not normal to have this many competing bureaucracies and levels of power, throughout one state like that, and I thought, I wonder if that plays a part. And I mentioned that because someone put a note that says in their town, and they say of 900 people, so the chief of police is like an alderman, I guess I don't know, supervisor of the water department, trash manager, sewer supervisor, controls 911. They say, quote, it's crazy in that, this person can, I guess, treat people or threats, he can threaten people and then it can just disappear. It's just, especially when you say like in small communities like that. And I see Professor Bell shaking her head. So you must have heard, like, what do the Griggs do? People who do live in small communities, their voice may feel even stifled, like, how you heard.
Yeah, this is something that I think a lot about, in part, just as, like I said, a South Carolinian. We have not as many counties, but a similar sort of situation where you have these police chiefs or sheriffs who run everything. And that is a very serious governance problem. And it is a governance problem that has its roots with racial injustice to begin with. So this is something we love to talk about local control and deference to, all the local counties and municipal officers. But understanding that what that does is give people localized power to use their discretion. And historically, it has been largely in racially unjust ways. So first, it's just like examining the roots of that. That is also relevant to the fact that in North Carolina, there is not a state civil rights statute. And so what that means is that there's not a way for the state to penetrate these local fiefdoms. That's something that is something that can be advocated around, and that like change needs to happen. And it's the type of governance problem that sounds less sexy than, I don't know, like training the police differently or what, the kind of the usual things that we talk about. But that type of governance change is really, really essential. And so there's a question in the chat, where the county's created to isolate, reduce white taxes, segregate schools. I can't say that they were created, that the counties weren't created, but a lot of the governance structures within them. So like school districts, like the need for police to have that, like for like each county to have its own sheriff. A lot of this goes back to ways in which, Black people in the South have been oppressed. So questions about what to do about this. One of them, like I said, is some of those governance structural reforms. There are a couple other things, and one of them is hard to bring up in this forum, but I just think, it's important to mention, is we have to think about accountability in other ways too. And by that, I mean, I don't actually know that, well, I just say this. I'd like to see other means of accountability for these harms, for these episodes of violence that are also structural forms, that are more forward-looking. So it's not just about holding an individual accountable for what they do. And that extends both to private actors, because, I mean, if we think about like, why would a white person just shoot, this innocent young Black man? It's in the back of the mind, the sense of impunity, knowing that you have standing in the community and nothing's going to happen to you. We need to be acting not in, back end way, but also forward looking ways. So things like community oversight of decisions that are made by criminal system actors, and not just civilian oversight in the traditional way, but real community accountability. Things like actually acknowledging police departments and criminal systems, acknowledging past harms and working with communities to develop structures to overcome them. And there's one final thing I just want to raise, and I'll stop talking for now. Jasmine Symington, who is a PhD student at the Michigan Sociology Department, has done some really fascinating work on disaster response in Marion, South Carolina, which is another low-income, predominantly Black rural county in South Carolina. And her work builds on my work on legal estrangement to talk about disaster response. And one of the things she finds is that FEMA goes into Marion County for disaster response, but they knew that they didn't have legitimacy in the community. They knew that people would distrust them, like the police, like the criminal system. And instead of just being like, okay, how do we build trust so that we can do this disaster response? They say, okay, well, we're gonna have to work around the fact that there's been a lot of harm done, and we're not going to have that type of trust. So how do we deliver the good of safety and security to this community? So they deferred to and deputized community organizations and faith leaders in particular, which are stronger in Marion, to do more of the actual work. So the work is happening without them being out front as the warriors and as the leaders of the whole safety security system. And I think policing and the criminal system can learn a lot from that type of example. And I'll just stop there for now.
Leonida, let me jump on that, because I think that
Yes.
is a really, Professor Bell has brought up something really important, which is that we have to have myriad ways of holding people accountable when they have harmed us, when they have broken our social contract. And often, I am a hammer, right? I really only have the only thing I really have is prison, right? But for a lot of victims, I mean, even in the Griggs's case, they have been harmed by somebody they know, right? So I think they said that their son, this was his child's grandfather who murdered him. Is that correct? So they're not strangers to each other. We often talk about the criminal legal system as if people are strangers, and that they have been threatened by somebody outside of their social circle and must be punished for that. When often what I see is, caretakers who have violated their children, people who have killed loved ones, people who have murdered neighbors. And so what we have tried to do in Durham is create opportunities for victims to be involved in creating accountability. And we've even done that in homicide cases. Now, in a homicide case, obviously, the defendant is still going to prison, right? But often in our homicide cases, these people knew each other. And so we have worked with our community partners to create a restorative justice program, and we don't force it on them, right? The victims have to want to come to the table. The defendant has to want to come to the table. A very good example is we recently did, and I say recently, I mean within the last year, we've done the restorative justice process with the young man who killed his grandfather. And it turned out that his grandfather had beat him when he was a child, and he'd been removed from his grandparents' house and sent with his mother. And then there was some more DSS action that got him back in his grandparents' house. And And so he shot his grandfather, and the family knew what the grandfather had done. They were not excusing the murder at all. But they knew that this young man eventually was going to come back, and they wanted to be able to reincorporate him into their family. And so with the help of partners, we created a restorative justice process for that family so that they can work on whatever they need to during the time that this young man is incarcerated and when he does get out, so that he still knows his family and his family still knows him. And we are not, we hear a lot of people talk about defund the police. We are not at that point, right? We don't have the community resources to do that, but we do as a community have the resources to deal with a lot of victims in different ways. I don't know, I wish I had an answer for the Griggs. One of the first things that I tell, especially families, when they've had a member of their family murdered or their child has been the victim of a very serious physical or sexual assault, is that there is no justice here. Right? I do not have justice. Would be the Griggs' son coming home that night. Right? And I cannot bring those people back. And most of the time I cannot even, we often hear families, even after a case, homicide cases can go on a couple years, sexual assault cases can go on longer than that. And for families, that's what they're holding on to. And we often hear for them after the trial or after the plea, that they didn't get what they needed. Like this process, the court process, they thought would make them whole. And it often doesn't. And so as a community, as a community, as human beings, really as a country, we have to do this differently. We cannot prosecute our way. We cannot prosecute our way out of violence, right? We also, there are lots of victims of this system, right? We see kids now whose parents were prosecuted 20 years ago. Right, and those people are victims as well as defendants. So, I'll like Professor Bell. I'll stop now.
Yeah, one thing that was brought up in the chat, and it brings back great memories. Going back to Nelson Mandela, and Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Remember that? And I know there was also a commission like that in Greensboro. At one point. But, Mr. and Mrs. Griggs, you actually, you have the ear of this governor's task force, to just sort of really to say whatever you want and what you need. And I know they're taking notes, and I see our time is running out here, but I know before we go, any last words from you and what you would like to see done, and this commission, as it comes together and tries to put some action behind these recommendations.
I think overall we would all agree that you can't legislate morality, and for justice to be fair, it's only as fair as those we entrust to enact it. And by the way of gerrymandering and the way districts are drawn, really influences who those elected officials are that are supposed to be representing us, and that comes back to our ability to get out and vote and put people in office such as DeBerry, DA DeBerry, to speak on our behalf and to realize where it is that we come from and where our position is. It comes all the way back down to the root to be able to get people out to vote, to be able to put people in office that represent our causes and speak on our behalf, and to be able to put laws in place that are people can uphold and be just and be fair. That's all people ask for, is just for justice and for fairness. And all you can ask for is the person in that office to have the integrity to be able to do so. With that, I'll hand over to Donald.
I think one of the things I would like for the task force to recommend, it may have been recommended already, is to have civilian oversight, or give the Attorney General to change the law where the Attorney General can come in and appoint a special prosecutor, like in a case of ours, when you see the injustice in this, and that it's involving the sheriff department, and you're expecting the sheriff department to refer them, to get someone to come in to investigate them. There should be some way that that as a victim, that we can be able to have someone that we can go to. And so if the attorney general had that power without having the DA or the sheriff department to refer to them, but to be able to come in to do that without their input, or even have a civilian task force or someone that we can go to and share our stories with them and let them look at it, and maybe they can make a recommendation to the attorney general. Say, look, we need someone to come in and to intervene in this case for the Griggs. That the sheriff department, they're involved in this. They're saying that they changed the crime scene to protect this person. And we did, we were there, we saw it. So we know they did. So you would think that if there was a sheriff department or a DA, that they are hearing this about those deputies are still there that changed this crime scene. They're still working there. That you would want to do the right thing for your county, for your town, to look into this. You wouldn't want those deputies working on but they don't care here. And so I feel like there has to be a voice for victims when you're in these rural areas where you are oppressed by, that your voice is not heard because you're brown, Black, or or poor. There has to be someone way you be able to have a voice here.
We've spoken to the NAACP. We've spoken with the North Carolina Black Caucus. All these organizations, and we've talked about a thing at one point in time called Christian's Law, the ability to be able to take it out of the hands of the DA or the sheriff and have it referred to a special prosecutor. But some of the things you hear when I talk about the gerrymandering and voting is that if I get this in the committee, I can never get it out. The reason is because we don't have the right people in the committee.
When I think about, this session that we've been afforded, which has been a great discussion. Thank you. I hear trust over and over. I hear accountability over and over, and I hear reconciliation over and over. And hopefully the task force is listening to that and keeping notes to make sure there's some combination of that. But just like you said, Mr. Griggs, it always comes back to voting, doesn't it? It kind of comes back to people knowing that their vote counts and that there's power in that, right? I know my dad used to always say, well, you can't complain if you didn't vote. You can't expect even anything if you didn't vote. So, and that's a hot topic now that we can talk about all night, about voting rights right now. But I guess our time is ending. I don't know if I've gotten a signal yet, but definitely I'd like to thank the Griggs family and DA DeBerry and Professor Monica Bell, and of course, the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice for having this learning session. And there is a third learning session coming up here on October 20th. And so it's going to be substance use as a public health crisis. I hope I got that right. But these are going to be going on for a while. So thank you very much. And I'm honored that I was able to moderate. Any ending words, Jasmine?
No, not at all. Thank you so much. Thank you.